All right. So usually I ask if somebody else wants to read, but I'm going to go ahead and read for us today because I'm going to read from the Message version of the Bible because I think it lends itself to getting through this conversation or the text a little bit easier, and it helps divide it a little bit better to help us get through it. So I'm going to read the first 7 verses from 2 Samuel 7, verses 1 through 17. Before long, the king made himself at home, and God gave him peace from all his enemies. Then one day, King David said to Nathan the prophet, "Look at this. Here I am, comfortable in a luxurious house of cedar, and the chest of God sits in a plain tent." Nathan told the king, "Whatever is on your heart, go and do it. God is with you." But that night the word of God came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is God's word on the matter. You're going to build a house for me to live in. Why, I haven't lived in a house from the time I brought the children of Israel up from Egypt till now. All that time I've moved around with nothing but a tent. And in my travels with Israel, did I ever say to any of the leaders I commanded to shepherd Israel, 'Why haven't you built me a house of cedar?'" Hello, Pat Adams.
Hi,
You
I'm
just
sorry I
joined
had
us.
some computer problems, so if you don't
No,
mind telling me where we are, I'll
of course.
catch up. Thank you.
We're 2 Samuel chapter 7.
Okay, thank
And
you.
1 through 17. I just read the first 7 verses, and I read from the Message version, so it's a little different from probably what all
Yes.
of you are going to have in front of you. For those reading along with, what are some of the differences from what you were reading versus what I was reading?
The ark versus the, what did you call it? The chest?
Oh, the chest
Ark
versus the ark. Mm-hmm.
of the covenant?
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, so as a little bit of context here, we're talking about King David and the prophet Nathan. And God is talking to David through Nathan, and so talking with Nathan about this time that David has come and has come to a place where he's settling, and he has built a house of cedar, and that he has the mind to make a similar house for the Ark of the Covenant where God resides at this time in biblical history.
Also,
go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was skipping to something else that was different. I thought you were done.
Nope. Yeah, I was pretty much done with that point.
Okay. Also, you read, since God brought up the children of Israel from Egypt, and mine says people.
Yours says what?
People of Israel.
Okay. People versus children. Yeah.
Children.
Yeah. One of the commonalities, I think, is in that first verse, which I think is important. And it says that the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies. So that first verse, it's setting the stage where King David has come and settled in his house, and that he has time to not be fighting others. His enemies aren't attacking, he's not attacking his enemies, and that this is a gift that God gives. And I think it's an important one, this concept of rest. Perhaps nowadays we have more time to rest than maybe we really need. Maybe not all of us, but in quote unquote normal times, I think rest is something that we all seek after and perhaps take a little bit for granted. But here it highlights, and it's pretty easy to step over it, but this gift of rest in between conquering or fighting, and in between projects. And actually this gives David the time to think about what his next project is, and that this is building a house for the Lord. What are some other things that we noticed about these first 7 verses?
What? I'm sorry.
No.
Somebody
Go
else
ahead.
say something. Go ahead, Pat.
Nathan assures David that God is with him.
Mm-hmm.
He says, go do all that's in your heart. The
Right.
Lord is with you.
Right. Yeah, and this is Nathan's first appearance in the text. So a new prophet on the scene. But he begins by saying, go do all that you have in your mind, for the Lord is with you. So Nathan is approving the plan to go ahead and do this, build this cedar temple for the ark and for God. Yeah. Mars, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to mention that same thing, but then later, God says, what are you doing? When did I ever ask anybody to build me a house or a temple?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting.
I'm trying to read who he said that to.
So he's saying it to
To Nathan to go tell David. Yeah.
Right. Right.
So Nathan sort of spoke up without consulting God first, I guess.
Yeah,
It
it's
seems
a
like.
little bit.
It seems like.
Yeah, it's a little different tone from the NRSV, which I have, the Lutheran Study Bible here, versus the Message version. It starts with a question of, so in verse 5, you're going to build a house for me to live in? And the Message kind of colloquially says, why, I haven't lived in a house from the time I brought the children of Israel up from Egypt till now. So kind of pointing out and kind of saying, well, I've just been in a tent for all this time, and now I'm going to get a house. Kind of a strange phrasing, if you will, from God. But that's what's recorded here. And so we can get the, go ahead.
When have I ever asked you to do that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wherever have I moved from about among all the people of Israel? Oh, I'm sorry. Wherever did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whom I commanded. Why have I and said to them, why have you not built me a house of cedar?
Mm-hmm.
So he's telling Nathan to go say that to David.
Right.
You know, I haven't told anybody else what makes you so special that you think you need to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the feeling I get.
Yeah. It's kind of ambiguous, given the two parts of that piece, kind of a surprise versus, well, I haven't told anyone to do that. So yeah, it could be a little bit ambivalent on, so why are you doing it? But I think we may hear a little bit more as we go on. So I'm going to go ahead and read verses 8 through 11 here, again in the Message version. So here is what you are to tell my servant David. The God of the angel armies has this word for you. I took you from the pasture, tagging along after sheep, and made you prince over my people Israel. I was with you everywhere you went, and mowed your enemies down before you. Now I'm making you famous, to be ranked with the great names on earth. and I'm going to set aside a place for my people Israel and plant them there so they'll have their own home and not be knocked around anymore. Nor will evil men afflict you as they always have, even during the days I set judges over my people Israel. Finally, I'm going to give you peace from all your enemies. All right, again, so what are these differences that you have versus what I read?
There certainly was quite a substitute for the phrase of Lord Almighty.
Right.
That he used in the message. I forget just what it was.
Yeah.
About the angels.
Angel armies.
Yeah, the God of the angel armies versus God Almighty or the Lord of hosts. Yeah, it kind of breaks that down into kind of its more derivative words. Yeah, so we get a little bit more context through this piece on what God is thinking and how God is reacting and will act given the news that David wants to do this thing for God. And so the God of the angel armies, the Lord of hosts, has traveled around in just this tent for how long since the people came up out of Egypt? And
I have a question. Is this after David had all those wars that were going on and finally
so
settled
after
somewhere?
after some of the wars, but not, so it's before most of the big ones.
Okay.
So in the Lutheran Study Bible, actually the beginning of chapter 8 is titled David's Wars. So there's plenty more conflict to come. This is before the wars with the Ammonites and the Arameans. It's before Bathsheba and Uriah. It's before Solomon is born, obviously. It's before the Ammonites. So yeah.
But it's after his defeat of the Philistines in chapter 5.
Of course, yeah.
So at least he has something behind him, huh?
Exactly. Yeah, so David is here and has defeated Goliath and the Philistines.
So he's in Jerusalem? This house that he built is in Jerusalem?
Yes. So chapter 6 is David brings the ark to Jerusalem.
Oh yeah, I see that now. Okay.
No, yeah. So it's good to see where we are in the story of David.
Okay.
And it really is this lull, because it repeats again in verse 11. Finally, I'm going to give you peace from all your enemies. At the beginning of this chapter, it says that God gave him peace from all his enemies. And so this is kind of alluding to this temporary respite or retreat, not retreat from war, but a retreat where he does not have to participate in conflict. But in verse 11, it's saying that God will eventually give David's house and David himself, really, this everlasting peace from all the enemies. And there's kind of it points a little bit to the strangeness that, again, this God of the angel armies, this Lord of hosts, this all-powerful God, almighty God, has just been going around in a tent for so long. And so why do we think that is?
Well, is that when they used the ark before to march in front of the armies to protect them and to grant them victory? Were they using the ark for that at that time?
In part, I think it
That
becomes,
later.
yeah, I think it comes more later.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so it states that even when the people of Israel have stopped traveling for a time, they still never built a house or a kind of a more permanent structure. It's always been in a tent.
Well, but sorry, I had all these questions. But was their goal in fighting the previous wars, the ones that they've come up with, and now they're in Jerusalem, was the objective to get to Jerusalem and set up his kingdom there?
I think so. I think up until this point, they've just been very nomadic. And they're really with the beginning of the book of Samuel. So the first book, First Samuel, and originally Samuel was one book, but eventually was split into First and Second Samuel. But we see this shift in the desires of the people of Israel towards the beginning of First Samuel, the shift away from wanting to not be nomadic, and also wanting to shift away from just having judges and prophets and tribal leaders. They wanted a king. And so they first got King Saul. And this was after God, through the prophets, said, no, you don't really want a king. The only reason you want a king is because all these other nations are having kings and you see it as kind of a fad. You don't really want a king. And the people of Israel said, no, we really do. And God said, no, you don't. And Israel said, yes, we do. And so God said, okay, I'll give you a king. And they get Saul, who then turns out to not be a great king. And so it even mentions later on that contrasting David with Saul, saying that God says, I will give you my love forever, not like Saul, who I took my love away from, but you will have essentially God's blessing forever. And yet, even David is not the greatest and most benevolent or altruistic king either, as we know with Bathsheba and Uriah, how David does not take their marriage seriously and has Uriah killed. So it just points again to the fact that, well, even though David is pointed to as one of the great kings and he did a lot of great things, he's still human, and it points to the fact that God was right. You don't really want a king. I think it goes to that point of absolute power corrupts absolutely. Because David was just a faithful shepherd boy at the beginning of all this, lowly beginnings, and long down the line of his family of succession, had a lot of brothers ahead of him, and so he would have just kind of lived a no highlighted life, just tending sheep and doing what his family needed. And yet God chose to raise this lowly, societal lowly person up to be a king. And yet, despite his humble beginnings, David gets ahead of himself and chooses to look away from what God is teaching and where God wanted to lead the people, and turns to his own desires and to take Bathsheba for his own and do all these other things, kind because he wanted them. But we are here in this chapter, and it's God saying that because David wants to do this thing in honor and to the glory of God by bringing God's people to a place where they can have rest, and thus allowing God to have not just a house of cloth, a tent around the ark, because David wants to do this, God will in turn honor David and David's family and descendants. So let's look at the last couple verses here, verses the second part of 11 through 17. Furthermore, God has this message for you. God himself will build you a house. When your life is complete and you're buried with your ancestors, then I'll raise up your child, your own flesh and blood, to succeed you, and I'll firmly establish his rule. He will build a house to honor me, and I will guarantee his kingdom's rule permanently. I'll be a father to him, and he'll be a son to me. When he does wrong, I'll discipline him in the usual ways, the pitfalls and obstacles of his mortal life. But I'll never remove my gracious love from him, as I removed it from Saul, who preceded you and whom I most certainly did remove. Your family and your kingdom are permanently secured. I'm keeping my eye on them, and your royal throne will always be there, rock solid. Nathan gave David a complete and accurate account of everything he heard and saw in the vision. All right, so what do we hear in that last part?
Well, Solomon is going to have the king ship after David, and it will continue. Excuse me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so essentially God is prophesying here that, okay, well, David's going to die at some point, and that he promises David that his own child, who will be Solomon, will take his place. And not just take his place, not just take something that is broken or is not worth a whole lot. God is saying Solomon will inherit David's kingdom and will expand on it and will make it prosper and will create a house for God as we know it, Solomon's temple. So what do we think? I mean, these 17 verses here, there's perhaps not as much excitement or not as much impact as we might have from some of our other verses. It doesn't have as many details packed into it as maybe Jesus's parables and that kind of stuff. So what impact do these verses have on the rest of David's story, on the rest of Israel's story, on the rest of the story beyond and into Christ's time and Christendom?
Well, God in this case gives the assurance that even just as the father has to discipline, he will have to discipline this son if he does things wrong. The love will be everlasting. It won't go away. Just as hopefully when we have good parent-child relationships, even when their correction needs to take place, love is part of that correction. Mm-hmm. And love continues in the everyday, day in, day out relationship. Mm-hmm. It must have been quite a reassurance to David to hear, hey, the house of David will go on and on. It's going to last forever. It will not come to an end.
Yeah, that I like both of those pieces there. Yeah, I think it's a nice reassurance, letting David know that, okay, there will be some times where I'll need to course correct either Solomon or the rest of your descendants, but that love, that God's love would not be missing there. That, in fact, even if God is angry with God's people, that's not the solo emotion. It's not the emotion in a vacuum. It's actually, God is angry because God loves David's children and all of God's children. God is doing that course correction or those discipline actions out of love for them. And so the fact that they may feel chastised, or they may feel that God has left them because of this punishment that they're experiencing, well, God is saying, no, God is with them. If God went with them through their nomadic times, this will just be a different kind of nomadic time where they have strayed from the path of God. And of course, we'll have times in the future, past 1st and 2nd Samuel, where the people of God will go into diaspora and into exile, and it'll be the renewal of this cycle. They mentioned that God has been going around in the tent since they were taken up out of slavery, out of exile into Egypt. Well, that cycle will return, and bad times will return, but God and God's love will stay with them throughout. And going back to that forever piece, there's a little note on the side of the Luther Study Bible saying that the word forever appears 8 times in this chapter, and God speaks it 3 times in verse 13 and 16, and then past our particular piece of the text, David boldly claims it 5 times from verse 24 to 29. It stresses the permanence of David's house and God's promise. And then it mentions that in Luke 1, both Mary, mother of Jesus, and Zechariah will sing of God's promise being fulfilled in Jesus. So this forever piece, and Jesus as a son of David, so a descendant of David, this forever piece is being proclaimed and continued and fulfilled all the way into the New Testament. And so really with verse 16 especially, in the NRSV it says, "Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me." So again, this promise language. Your throne shall be established forever. So even into the time of Jesus, when the people of Israel are being occupied by the Roman Empire, this comes true, and God keeps God's word by having that throne return to God. So before there were kings in Israel, the throne was God's, and the people said they wanted a king, like I said before. And so even though God was their king, God said, okay, you can have a human king. And by connecting it all the way through to the Gospels here, having Jesus being both human and God at the same time, God is able to keep God's promise here saying that your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, your throne shall be established forever. In this way, God both keeps God's promise to have that throne be there forever, in how David and the other Israelites would interpret of having a human on it, but also reclaiming that throne and focusing on God as the King of Kings. So Jesus as the Son of Man and the Son of God, taking that throne and keeping it whole and intact and sovereign forever. Any other thoughts or responses to what we were just talking about there? It's interesting, in another commentary, it notes that, so there's a lot of wonderful promise language in here, but also there's some things that lead to conflict later on. So let's see here. This chapter gives the reason why the United Kingdom of Israel is then later divided into the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah in 1 Kings 11 and 12, because God promised David in 2 Samuel 7 that a Davidic king would always rule. One tribe is given to David's descendants. So later on in 1 Kings, we see the division of the kingdom of Israel again into Israel and Judah. And it's because of this conflict, in part because of this conflict, that the one kingdom wanted David's descendants to sit on the throne, and the other wanted other people to sit on the throne. And they also disagreed on where they wanted to worship and that kind of thing. But because of the human interpretation of really this 16th verse, some wanted to adhere to it so rigidly, and others wanted to interpret it more broadly. So rigidly as in the direct bloodline of David versus the descendants of the king. So kind of more broadly, all of the subjects of the king, all of the those responsible to the king, and who the king is ideally supposed to be responsible to as well. One faction wanted David's direct descendants to sit on the throne versus one of the people of Israel.
Does this extend down into the nation of Israel today?
How so? Like, how are you wondering?
Well, the promise of that God would always be with them.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I mean, the Jewish people have gone through so much persecution.
Mm-hmm.
My question
but
is,
then they went back, and the nation of Israel was established again, and they did go back.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if this is a continuation of this promise.
are the boundaries of Israel at that time given?
Say that again, Ray?
Are the boundaries of Israel at that time given?
I'm missing the word
Boundaries.
after boundaries.
Boundaries.
Gotcha. The wars that David will do after this chapter actually lead to the expansion of Israel's borders and boundaries. I'm sure that there are some biblical scholars that would say, oh yeah, at this point in the story, at chapter 7, the boundaries and the borders of Israel are X. Safe to say that they are probably very different from the current nation of Israel. And to Pat's question, I would answer that yes, God remains with God's people to this day with the people in Israel. And for the Jewish people, I would say that God was with them even in their various diasporas and their various persecutions, because you're right. The Jewish people have gone through a lot. I mean, most notably, we have the Holocaust, of course, but there were other times in histories where there were organized and specific persecutions of Jewish people, whether it be in Western Europe, in the traditional Germanic area with the Holocaust, or to Eastern Europe with Russia and those kinds of areas, to Spain, to all kinds of places. Up until today, I mean, there's still plenty of anti-Semitism alive and well, unfortunately, within our own country. And yet,
well, at the time,
I'll just finish that thought real quick. And yet, God promises to be with them in the good times, in those times of rest, in those times of respite, as well as the bad times. We can kind of point to those times of forced nomadic times where they weren't able to call any one place their home. And you're right, Pat, they were able to, after the Second World War, go back to the land of Israel, and that many Jewish people were able to come back together and call that place their home. And now there is still more of a chosen diaspora. There are Jewish people all over the world. And so whether they're in the land of Israel or all over the place, they are able to say and believe, and God holds true to the promise of God is with them wherever they are.
well, at the time of the formation of Israel, the UN was all for it, the USA was against it, and Russia was all for it. But once the country was formed, both countries changed their mind. The Jewish left Israel, wanted to return to Russia, and they said, no way, we got rid of you. And the U.S. said, well, we changed our mind. There are a lot of Jewish votes, particularly New York.
One moment, please.
They have always kept the promise, though, the Jewish people, that they are the chosen, God's chosen people, haven't they?
Repeat that question, sorry.
I said the Jewish people, no matter where they are, have always kept the promise that they are God's chosen people, haven't they? In their own.
Yeah, they maintain that belief. And through our, I mean, we consider the Jewish faith as part of our faith, as part of our tradition, in terms of Jesus being a Jewish rabbi and very much a Jew himself. We are not superseding or taking over. We are just another branch of this faith where we continue to build on the tradition of the prophets, and we continue to learn from where David came from and everyone.
Well, the Hebrews are primarily in control of Israel, are they not?
Oh, absolutely. The Jewish people are, and in contrast to the Palestinian people, the Jewish people are the national government and leadership for the most part. There are some representation of other non-Jewish peoples within the government, but so I mean, and that's what the nation of Israel was set up for, was to create a homeland for Jewish people to be able to return to. And it's really just a continuation of the places that we're seeing in this particular chapter, where that tradition of believing what God says and God's promising this land. It's literally the promised land where they go to out of Egypt.
And then the dilemma in our own time that continues from the creation of the state of Israel after World War II is the displacement of all the Palestinians that were there and their loss of property, et cetera,
Right.
that have not been rectified. And I think, at least in the era that I was raised, I can remember like in junior high, I think they collected money to plant trees in Israel. I mean, there was always that sense of Israel and our support for Israel, but I don't think until I reached adulthood that I gained that awareness of the unfairness of what had happened to the Palestinians in the process.
Right. Yeah, so the intent is certainly a good one in restoring the nation of Israel and as a place where Jews from all over the world can go, right? And as it usually goes with these kinds of things, it's not as simple as, well, magically everything's all right, because there were people there, and so it wasn't as simple as, okay, the doors are open and everyone's going to go in and everyone's going to be really happy because the area of Israel is the Holy Land for many different, so 3 major faiths in the world at least, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the different branches from those 3. Which means that there's going to be a lot of emphasis in that area. Here, one.
Now the Gaza Strip, isn't that kind of both of them now? Aren't they kind of coming together on that?
Not the UN.
I don't know about
Well,
the UN.
Palestine.
I don't know, and Pastor's moving to another room.
Okay.
Get us a
You
little.
know what's happened to Gaza?
I'm not sure.
So yeah, I mean, Palestine is still not recognized by a lot of the world, right? It is recognized only as a part of Israel, and because of the conflicts and the difference in interpretation of who can have Israeli citizenship, you have this kind of situation where a lot of the Palestinians don't have the same protections or the same rights or the same recognition as other nations of the world, including Israelis.
I've got a question.
Go ahead.
Does Israel permit the establishment of a Lutheran church in Israel?
So there's a Lutheran church of, trying to remember the exact name of the denomination. It's something like, I think it's the Lutheran Church of the Holy Land and Jordan. It's its own Lutheran denomination, but we have, as the ELCA, connection to it. there's a Lutheran church in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And there's a
My
couple.
niece went to.
But in Israel itself,
So Bethlehem is in Israel.
I know, but in Israel itself, including Bethlehem.
So yes, it's there.
I mean, the permitted Lutheran church outside of Bethlehem.
Yeah, he said yes. At one point, I'd heard that there were more Lutherans in Palestine than in Israel. You know, the Lutheran Church had more establishment there.
Because there's also, so in Israel proper, there's, of course, peoples of various religions. In Israel proper, and not the Palestinian lands, there's, of course, a majority of Jewish people, but there are Palestinian Christians, and there are Palestinian
Jews.
There are Palestinian Jews. And really, if you look at it, in the past, there's been an incredible art exhibition where this artist took pictures of two people standing next to each other. One was a Jew, and one was a Muslim, and they were both from that region. And to just look at them, you'd be hard pressed to say, okay, that person is the person of Jewish faith, and that's the person of Islamic faith. So that juxtaposition, saying that these people come from the same origins, from the same area, really from the same religious origins as well. And that these divisions that we see today are human-made. They're made up by us because we don't want to get along, essentially.
Well, does Israel distinguish between the Hebrew and the Jewish and the Israel? Hebrew and the Jewish?
There's those three different terms, Jewish, Israeli, and Hebrew. Somebody could be all three of those. But they also have a little bit more nuance than that. And each of those three terms means very similar things. They have the connotation of usually Jewish descendants or faith or something along those lines. But it's sort of like Hispanic and Latino are sometimes thought of as synonymous, but also can mean different things. So there are Latino people who are not Hispanic. It's a question of definition and what each of those terms specifically means. So yes, they do distinguish between the three, but people can have overlap of those different terms.
Okay.
Yeah, so points to our text here points to the fact that again, this place where the beginning is God giving David rest to consider what to do besides conflict, and David chooses well. Does this act to glory God and to advance his people, and God is trying to teach this lesson of rewarding doing things for people rather than against people. And so God gives this promise of God will be with God's people forever. And God keeps that promise. But again, it's within this cycle of God does something wonderful for the people of God, and the people of God are happy and they have these great things, but it also then, as human nature, as we're coming up on our Reformation Sunday, and to kind of tie in a Lutheran theme here, we are simultaneous saints and sinners. So we have that capability of being the saint and living into and leaning into the goodness of God and the goodness within ourselves, but we also have that capability of focusing on the sinfulness that we are capable of, our selfishness that we are capable of. So that part of the cycle is um, people have it good and God has helped them, but then they get complacent. They get to a place where they don't really feel like helping their neighbor out. They don't feel like uh, participating in God's mission. They don't feel like paying attention to God at all. They just want to do what they want to do. We see it with David as again, he goes and does the horrible things he does with Bathsheba and Uriah's family. And so when there's that shift from them wanting to, the people of God wanting to help each other out and to be selfless and to focus on what God is leading them to, then if they focus on those pieces, then there are continued good times. But if they stray from God's way, if they only turn themselves in on themselves, if they give into that selfishness, then they drift from God. They find themselves being nomads again and being forced into nomad ship, shall we say. So, yeah. Any other questions or thoughts here?
Sort of becomes symbolic for each individual. You know, we have our moments when we're close to God and our moments when we've drifted away individually. I mean,
Absolutely.
as a nation, as a person, as a family, as a people, you know, it's sort of, it's something that just happens in life, you know.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. We can look at these cycles individually or as a community. Um, just like there's individual good times and individual sainthood, shall we say, there's also communal good times and communal grace. But there's also this concept of the other side of that coin is there's a concept of individual sin and communal sin, the state of sin that we find ourselves in. And the good news is that we have these promises, whether it be in our text today from 2 Samuel or throughout the Old Testament, through to the Gospels and the New Testament, where God promises that sin and selfishness and evil will not have the last word, and that we will never be left alone in those places. We'll never have to fight those things just by ourselves. We have a promise that God is going to be with us through all of it, and that the last word will be God's.
God's there through it all,
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
whether we recognize it or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really powerful concept and promise and gift that we have from God, that whether we know it or not, or whether we are in good times or not, God is there with us. And God is there not just as an observer, not just as someone to keep things going, but is there to comfort us, to give us care, and to love us for who we are. Very good.